Hi, I'm Nutt, and today I'll be going over the difference between intentional and negligent torts. Today is the 18th of April, 2018, and this is for cyber law. In order to understand the difference between negligent and intentional torts, one must understand what a tort even is. Torts are the intentional or unintentional harm of a person, and a tort would be only involved in a civil case. That's according to fine law. So there are different types of torts that can actually occur, and there are many different types of actions that lead to the torts. Some types of torts committed could be assault, battery, false imprisonment, or even trespassing on property. These are just examples of a few different torts, as there actually are many different types of torts that can be committed by a person. There are different categories of torts, such as cyber tort, but there's two different categories that we're going to be going over, and that would be the intentional tort versus the negligent tort. Intentional torts and negligent torts are not the same in any way, as there's different elements to the tort, there are different actions involved, and different reasons behind the committed crime or tort. Well, not crime. An intentional tort would be when a person intentionally acts in a certain way that leads to another person's injury. Basically, intentional torts occur when a person's actions committed harm against another person, mentally or physically. Some examples of the intentional tort would be assault, battery, false imprisonment, and trespass on property. An important element, though, to an intentional tort is that the person knowingly and willingly committed the wrongful action. When you're going to court as the plaintiff of a intentional tort that was committed against them, there's a few different things and elements that the plaintiff must prove. For a plaintiff to prove that there has been an intentional tort committed against them, the plaintiff must show harm committed by the defendant and the defendant only. The plaintiff also has to show evidence to the court that the defendant knowingly and willingly caused the harm as well. A good example of an intentional tort would be if a defendant was arguing with the plaintiff and the situation got tense and the defendant threw a stone at the plaintiff out of anger. This would intentionally harm the plaintiff and would actually be classified as an intentional tort. Next would be a negligent tort. Personal injury claims are frequently based on a negligence claim. Negligence is conduct that falls below a reasonable standard of care for the safety of those around you, according to fine law. Brian Craig would define a negligent tort as the failure to exercise the standard of care that a reasonable, prudent person would have exercised in a similar situation. Basically, a negligent tort would occur when a person's inaction or failure to act causes harm on another person. A good example of this would be if the defendant of a negligent tort was witnessing a person choking on food at a restaurant, and that person was a medical doctor. Since the defendant did not act on the situation and just observed the man choke, the actions not committed by the defendant and the medical doctor caused harm to another. The doctor should have acted in the situation, but did not, and in return can be held reliable for a negligent tort in a civil case. When you're a plaintiff and need to prove need to prove a negligent tort has been committed against you, there are actually four elements that the plaintiff must prove. First is the duty of care by the defendant. The plaintiff must prove it was the defendant's absolute duty to provide care in the circumstance. Next is breach. The plaintiff must prove the defendant had the duty to provide care and failed to do so. Thirdly, a defendant must actually cause the plaintiff's loss. The plaintiff must prove the loss was from only the defendant due to his or her lack of involvement, and the loss must be actual and proximate. And fourth and final, plaintiff must suffer damage. The plaintiff must prove that there was actual damage that can be fixed through monetary compensation. In the end, though, what's the difference between the intentional tort and the negligent tort? Well, the main difference between both torts are the actions committed and the thought process behind the action. An intentional tort differs from a negligent tort because the person was the actual reason the other person suffered harm and knowingly did the action, whereas a negligent tort differs because it is in the actual inaction of the defendant to prevent the harm, and the person who's committed a negligent tort allowed the person to suffer harm through their failure to provide care. The two torts are completely different. Intentional torts are typically intentionally done, or negligent torts can even be unintentionally done. My references are Brian Craig from Cyberlaw the book and Fine Law, and my references can be found on the PowerPoint provided. Thank you.